Commander Zedek's adjusted his neural crown as the proximity alarms echoed through the bridge of the Galactic Council vessel Harmony's Edge. The massive dreadnought, one of the last surviving ships of its class, hung in the void like a dying whale, its hull scarred by countless encounters with the Zerathi Collective. Around them, the remnants of the Council's once mighty fleet drifted in defensive formations that had become increasingly desperate with each passing cycle. "Sir, we're detecting massive spatial distortions at grid reference 77 Alpha," reported Lieutenant Vextai, her chitinous fingers dancing over holographic controls. The Zenthari officer's compound eyes reflected the amber warning lights that had become a permanent fixture on the bridge. "Whatever's coming through is big. Really big." Zethix's forearms moved in practice coordination, calling up tactical displays and sensor feeds. The distortions were unlike anything in their databases, crude, violent, and somehow completely wrong according to established jump space physics. It was as if someone had taken the elegant equations that governed faster-than-light travel and beaten them into submission with a plasma hammer. "Energy signatures are off the charts," muttered Dr. Kalahesh from her station, her crystalline form refracting the display lights into prismatic cascades. "These readings make no sense. They're using some kind of brute force approach to dimensional folding. It should tear their ships apart." The first vessel that emerged from the spatial tier looked like it had been designed by someone who had heard ships described secondhand and decided to improve on the concept. Where council vessels were graceful curves and flowing lines that worked in harmony with physical forces, this thing was a collection of angular blocks, exposed machinery, and what appeared to be weapon systems bolted onto every available surface. It was ugly, asymmetrical, and radiated an aggressive functionality that made Zethix's combat instincts scream warnings. Then another ship appeared. "And another, by the void," whispered Navigation Officer Threnki, his gas sack body deflating in shock. "How many of them are there?" The answer became apparent as the crude dimensional tear widened, disgorging a fleet that defied every tactical doctrine Zethix had studied in his 3 centuries of military service. The ships came in dozens of different configurations, from sleek interceptors bristling with missile pods to massive carriers that looked like mobile weapons platforms surrounded by protective shells. None of them matched any known design philosophy, and yet there was something disturbingly effective about their chaotic appearance. "Open communications," Zethix ordered, his primary voice sac vibrating with authority. "Standard first contact protocols." The response came immediately, transmitted on multiple frequencies simultaneously in what sounded like dozens of different languages. The universal translator struggled for several moments before settling on a rough approximation that somehow failed to capture the underlying intensity of the original transmission. "This is Fleet Admiral Sarah Chen of the United Earth Defense Force, 3rd Expeditionary Fleet. We received your distress beacon and came as soon as we could manage a jump corridor. What's the tactical situation?" Zethix blinked all 6 eyes in surprise. The voice was crisp, professional, and carried an undertone of barely contained energy that reminded him of the moments before a star went supernova. More disturbing was the casual mention of a 3rd Expeditionary Fleet, implying these humans had at least 2 others somewhere. "This is Commander Zethix of the Galactic Council Defense Force," he replied, activating his own translation matrix. "We appreciate your response to our plea for aid, Admiral Chen, but I must warn you that the situation is beyond hope. The Zerathi Collective has proven unstoppable. They've consumed the Corvin fleet, the crystalline armadas, and the combined might of 47 civilizations. Your ships, impressive as they appear, cannot—" "Commander," the human admiral interrupted, and there was something in her tone that made Zedix's spine ridges flatten instinctively. "With respect, we didn't come here to debate odds. We came here to kill some xeno-supremacist bugs. Now, where exactly are these Zerathi bastards?" The casual vulgarity in the human's language made the translator emit a confused harmonic. More concerning was the matter-of-fact way she spoke about engaging an enemy that had reduced the galaxy's greatest military powers to scattered refugees. It was like watching a juvenile predator casually discuss hunting an adult dreadnought. "Admiral Dr. Phonetic." Kalash interjected, her crystalline form shifting to project urgent data streams. "You must understand the nature of what you're facing. The Zerathi Collective doesn't simply destroy civilizations. They consume them. They take living beings and integrate them into their biomechanical matrix, creating hybrids that retain the knowledge and skills of their original forms while serving the Collective's hive intelligence. They've been doing this for millions of years. They have technologies we can't even comprehend. Tactics that—" "Doc," came a different voice over the channel, younger and with an accent the translator couldn't quite parse. You're describing bored with a biology twist. We've seen the movies. Hell, half our fleet designs were inspired by figuring out how to kill things exactly like that. There was a moment of silence on the council ship's bridge as everyone tried to process what they just heard. The humans seemed to be suggesting they'd prepared for this exact scenario based on entertainment media? Admiral Chen's voice returned, carrying what might have been amusement. What Lieutenant Torres means is that human military doctrine has spent considerable time analyzing hive mind scenarios. We've run countless simulations, developed specific countermeasures, and designed our weapon systems with distributed intelligence networks specifically in mind. The collective may be old and powerful, but they're fighting the last war. You don't understand, Zedek said, his frustration bleeding through the translator as harmonic discord. They adapt. Everything we've tried, every tactic, every weapon, they analyze it, counter it, and then use it against us better than we ever could. The Corvin Empire's final transmission showed their own ships turned against them, crewed by their own people twisted into something else entirely. And that's a problem, Admiral Chen acknowledged. But it's also an opportunity. Before Zethix could ask what she meant, proximity alarms began screaming across every ship in the area. The Zarathi had found them. The edge of the system erupted in spatial distortions that made the humans' crude jump technology look like precision engineering. Where the human ships had torn holes in space-time, the Zarathi seemed to step through reality itself, their biomechanical vessels emerging from dimensional folds that sealed seamlessly behind them. The first collective ship to appear was a fusion of living tissue and technological components that hurt to look at directly. Organic curves merged with crystalline matrices and metallic frameworks in patterns that suggested both advanced engineering and evolutionary development. It was beautiful in the way a cancer cell was beautiful, perfectly adapted, ruthlessly efficient, and utterly wrong. More ships followed. Dozens. Hundreds. The collective's fleet spread across local space like infection, each vessel unique yet part of a greater whole. Some were clearly adapted from conquered civilizations. Zethix could see Corvin design elements merged with Zenthari biotechnology and crystalline energy systems, all twisted into new configurations that improved on the original concepts. Sweet Jesus, someone muttered over the human comm channel. Those things are seriously ugly. Cut the chatter, Admiral Chen ordered. All ships, battle stations, weapons hot, shields up. Let's show these assholes what happens when you mess with biological diversity. Zethix watched in fascination and horror as the human fleet transformed. What had appeared to be chaotic positioning suddenly revealed itself as a three-dimensional formation that maximized fields of fire. While providing overlapping defensive coverage, weapons systems that had seemed randomly placed extended, rotated, and locked onto targets with precision that suggested advanced AI guidance. Admiral, he transmitted urgently, you need to withdraw immediately. Your ships are impressive, but the collective will adapt to your weapons and tactics within moments. You'll only be giving them new technologies to use against us. Commander, came the reply, and now Admiral Chen's voice carried something that made Zethex's predator instinct scream warnings. You're thinking like prey. We don't run from bullies. We make them regret being born. The first Zarathi ship opened fire with energy weapons that bent space around their discharge, sending lances of force that should have vaporized anything they touched. The targeted human vessel, an angular destroyer that looked like it had been assembled from weapon platforms, didn't even try to dodge. Instead, it angled its shields and took the hit dead on. The energy beam struck the human ship's defensive systems and simply stopped. Not absorbed, not deflected, stopped, as if the laws of physics had suddenly decided to take a different interpretation. Impossible, Dr. Kaliish whispered. Those were Void-class energy weapons. Nothing can withstand that level of focused power. Reactive armor, came a cheerful voice over the human channel. We borrowed the concept from tank design and scaled it up a bit. When you're dealing with energy weapons, the trick isn't to block them. It's to convince them they hit something else entirely. The human destroyer's return fire was immediate and devastating. Instead of the elegant energy weapons favored by most civilizations, the humans unleashed a barrage of what appeared to be solid projectiles moving at significant fractions of light speed. The kinetic weapons tore through the Zarathi ship's organic armor like it was tissue paper, exploding inside the vessel in ways that suggested they weren't simple metal slugs. Depleted uranium cores with tungsten penetrators and shaped antimatter charges, explained the same cheerful voice. We figured if you can't shoot through something, you shoot through it anyway and let physics sort it out. The Zerathi ship's biomechanical components began to writhe as they attempted to adapt to the damage, growing new armor plates and redirecting vital systems around the wounded areas. It was a fascinating display of adaptive engineering that had allowed the collective to overcome every weapon system they'd encountered. The human destroyer fired again. This time, the projectiles were completely different. Some kind of crystalline structure that seemed to vibrate with internal energy. When they struck the adapting Zerathi armor, the crystals shattered and released what looked like a swarm of microscopic machines that immediately began attacking the ship's biomechanical systems. Nanite clusters, the human explained, as if discussing the weather. They're programmed to recognize and dismantle biological integration protocols. We call them divorce lawyers, because they're really good at separating things that are supposed to work together. The Zerathi ship's attempts at adaptation suddenly reversed as the nanites began systematically destroying the connections between organic and mechanical components. Within moments, the vessel was tearing itself apart from the inside as its various systems lost cohesion. But the collective was already learning. The second wave of Zerathi ships approached with different defensive configurations. Their biomechanical matrices shifted to resist kinetic impact and resist nanite intrusion. The human fleet's response was immediate and incomprehensible. Every ship opened fire with completely different weapons. Some launched clouds of what appeared to be metallic debris, others fired beams that made space itself seem to ripple, and a few released swarms of small craft that moved with the erratic unpredictability of insects. "What are you doing?" Zethix demanded. "You're using different weapon systems against the same enemy type. That's completely inefficient and strategically unsound." "That's the point," Admiral Chen replied, and there was something that might have been satisfaction in her voice. "The collective strength is adaptation. They learn from what they encounter and develop countermeasures, but they can only adapt to what they understand. We're not giving them consistent data to work with." As if to prove her point, the metallic debris fired by one human ship suddenly revealed itself as a cloud of self-guided projectiles that changed course mid-flight to attack the Zerathi vessels from unexpected angles. The rippling space beams turned out to be some kind of dimensional weapon that folded portions of the enemy ships into pocket dimensions where they simply ceased to exist. The insect-like swarms attached themselves to Zerathi hulls and began rapidly constructing what looked like mining equipment. They're strip mining their armor while they're still fighting. Dr. Kalayash observed with something approaching awe. "Those machines are harvesting the biomechanical components and converting them into more drones." But it was the human fleet's movement patterns that truly defied understanding. Where every military doctrine emphasized formation integrity and coordinated maneuvers, the human ships seemed to operate on principles of organized chaos. They broke apart into individual units, each one operating independently while somehow maintaining overall strategic coordination. A Zerathi heavy cruiser managed to corner one of the human frigates, trapping it between two biomechanical dreadnoughts and preparing to demonstrate the futility of resistance. The frigate's response was to accelerate directly toward the larger enemy ship while simultaneously launching what appeared to be its entire crew in escape pods. "Are they abandoning ship?" Vextai asked in confusion. The answer came when the frigate struck the Zerathi cruiser's hull and detonated in an explosion that didn't just destroy both vessels. It opened a temporary rift in space-time that sucked in two other collective ships before collapsing. Meanwhile, the escape pods revealed themselves as independent fighting craft that immediately engaged the surviving Zerathi vessels with weapons that seemed specifically designed to exploit the chaos of the moment. "That was a kamikaze run," Admiral Chen explained matter-of-factly. "The crew evacuated to assault pods before impact. We lose one ship, they lose three, and our people get to continue fighting. It's basic mathematics with a human twist." Zethex realized his mouth was hanging open. The humans weren't just fighting the Zerathi collective. They were fighting them with tactics that seemed to come from a completely different understanding of warfare itself. Where every other civilization had tried to match the collective's advantages, the humans seemed determined to make the entire concept of adaptation irrelevant through sheer unpredictability. A new group of Zerathi ships emerged from the dimensional folds, these ones clearly adapted specifically to counter the weapons they'd observed. Their armor was designed to resist kinetic impact, their biomechanical systems were hardened against nanite intrusion, and their formation patterns were optimized to minimize exposure to the humans' chaotic attack vectors. The human fleet's response was to fire flowers. Actual flowers. Thousands of them, launched from specially configured torpedo tubes in massive colorful clouds that looked like some kind of bizarre celebration rather than military action. "Admiral Chen," Zethix said carefully, "I believe your weapons systems may be malfunctioning." "Oh, those aren't weapons," she replied cheerfully. "Those are roses." Specifically, they're genetically modified earth roses that have been bred to survive in vacuum and emit pheromone signals that closely resemble Xerathi mating displays. There was a moment of absolute silence on the communications channel as everyone tried to process this information. Then the Xerathi fleet began to react. The biomechanical ship's organic components started responding to what they perceived as reproductive signals from their own species. Internal systems began redirecting resources toward biological functions that had nothing to do with combat. Weapon systems powered down as energy was diverted to reproductive organs that began emerging from hull plating in ways that would have been embarrassing if the collective had been capable of embarrassment. "We've been studying your enemy for the 3 months it took us to get here," Admiral Chen explained as human ships moved in to exploit the chaos. "Turns out, when you integrate biological components into your technology, you inherit biological weaknesses along with biological advantages. And every biological system has exploitable vulnerabilities. That's brilliant, Dr. Khan," Kalaya said, her crystalline form shifting through spectrums that indicated intense analytical interest. "You're using the collective's greatest strength against them." "Actually," came another human voice, this one with a different accent, "that's just the opening move. Jenkins, deploy the psychological warfare package." Zethix had no idea what a psychological warfare package might entail, but the human ships immediately began broadcasting something that made the collective's biomechanical vessels start behaving even more erratically. The transmission seemed to be some kind of audio-visual pattern that caused the organic components to experience what could only be described as panic attacks. "What are you broadcasting to them?" he asked. "Human teenagers arguing about music preferences," Admiral Chen replied. "We discovered that the chaotic emotional intensity of human adolescent social dynamics translates into a kind of psychic static that overwhelms most hive-mind communication protocols. The collective's distributed intelligence network is basically having a nervous breakdown right now. As if summoned by her words, the main Xerathi command vessel finally emerged from its dimensional fold. It was a massive biomechanical cathedral that seemed to be part grown and part built, its form suggesting architecture from a dozen different civilizations all merged into something that was somehow greater than the sum of its parts. Energy patterns flowed through its organic surfaces like blood through veins, and when it spoke, the transmission carried harmonics that made reality itself seem to shiver. Unknown entities, the collective's voice resonated across all frequencies simultaneously. You employ tactics outside acceptable parameters. Your approach to warfare lacks logical foundation. Explain your motivations. Admiral Chen's response was immediate and delivered with cheerful professionalism that somehow made it even more ominous. "We're humans, buddy. Logical foundation is for species that haven't figured out how to make physics cry. Our motivation is simple. You hurt people, so we're going to hurt you back until you stop. It's not complicated." "You are inefficient," the collective replied, though there seemed to be something like confusion in its harmonics. "Your tactics waste resources and violate established combat doctrine. Why do you not adapt to superior methodologies?" "Because," Admiral Chen said, and her voice carried a warmth that was somehow more terrifying than any threat, "adaptation is what prey species do when they can't change their environment. We're not prey, collective. We're the thing that prey species evolved to run away from." The human fleet's next attack was coordinated, devastating, and absolutely insane. Every ship fired simultaneously, but instead of targeting the collective vessels, they aimed at empty space in a pattern that seemed to make no tactical sense whatsoever. Until the weapons fire converged and created a localized gravitational anomaly that began pulling the Xerathi fleet into a configuration that left them perfectly positioned for the second wave of human attacks, which turned out to be a combination of antimatter warheads, dimensional disruptors, and what appeared to be weaponized black holes. "How?" Kalash whispered as the collective's formation dissolved into chaos. "How did you calculate those trajectories? The gravitational mathematics alone should have taken cycles to compute." "We didn't calculate anything," came a cheerful response from what was apparently the human fleet's science officer. "We just asked our kids what would happen if we shot gravity guns at nothing and then did whatever they suggested." Human children have an intuitive understanding of physics that gets trained out of them as they grow up. Sometimes the best way to solve an impossible problem is to give it to someone who doesn't know it's impossible. As the battle continued to unfold in ways that violated every principle of military science Zethix had ever learned, he began to understand something that chilled him to his core. The humans weren't just defeating the Xerathi collective through superior technology or tactics. They were defeating them by refusing to play by any recognizable rules whatsoever. and they were doing it with the casual competence of a species that had clearly spent considerable time thinking about exactly this scenario. The immediate aftermath of the first engagement left the bridge of the Harmony's Edge in stunned silence. Around them, the debris field that had moments before been a Zerathi assault force drifted in expanding clouds of biomechanical fragments, some still twitching with residual neural activity. The human fleet had reformed into loose defensive positions, their ships showing minimal damage despite having just annihilated an enemy force that should have been orders of magnitude superior. Casualty reports, Admiral Chen's voice came through the communications array, crisp and professional despite having just orchestrated what could only be described as tactical impossibility. Frigate Democracy's Edge is gone, but all crew successfully evacuated to assault pods, came a response from somewhere in the human formation. Destroyer Righteous Indignation took some structural damage when that biocruiser tried to eat it, but engineering says the whole breach actually improved ventilation in the lower decks. Copy that. What's our ammunition status? Kinetic rounds at 70%, nanite clusters at 85%, and we've got plenty of flowers left. The teenagers are asking if they can try arguing about video games next time. Apparently their music debate wasn't quite chaotic enough. Zethex found himself staring at the tactical displays, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. The humans had not only defeated a Zerathi force, they'd done it while discussing logistics in terms that suggested this was routine combat operations, rather than a desperate last stand against an unstoppable enemy. Admiral Chen, he transmitted, his voice carrying harmonics of profound confusion, your tactical reports suggest minimal losses against an enemy that has destroyed entire civilizations. How is this possible? There was a brief pause before Chen responded, and when she did, her tone carried something that might have been sympathy. Commander, with respect, I think you've been approaching this problem from the wrong direction. The Collective isn't unstoppable. They're just using a strategy that works against enemies who fight the way everyone expects military conflicts to work. The Collective has adapted to counter every weapon system, every tactical doctrine, every strategic approach attempted by 47 different civilizations, Dr. Kaliyesh interjected, her crystalline form shifting to display the accumulated data from decades of failed resistance efforts. Their biomechanical integration allows them to rapidly analyze and counter any consistent methodology. What makes you believe human approaches will be different? Because we don't have consistent methodologies, came a different voice from the human fleet, the one who'd mentioned teenagers earlier. I'm Dr. South. Amanda Singh, xenobiology specialist and apparently this fleet's expert on fighting hive minds. The fundamental problem with fighting an adaptive enemy is that adaptation requires predictable patterns to work with. Most military doctrines are based on repeatable tactics that can be refined and improved over time. That's basic military science, Lieutenant Vextai observed, her compound eyes reflecting the data streams flowing across her displays. Consistent tactics allow for coordinated operations and strategic planning. Exactly, Dr. Singh agreed. And that's why the Collective has been so successful. They're optimized to counter logical, predictable approaches to warfare. But human military doctrine is, let's call it, aggressively improvisational. Before anyone could ask what that meant, proximity alarms began signaling another dimensional fold forming at the edge of the system. This time, the Zerathi emergence was different, more cautious, more organized. The biomechanical vessels that emerged from the fold had clearly been modified based on observations from the first engagement. Their hulls showed adaptations designed to resist kinetic impact. Their formation patterns were optimized to counter the humans' chaotic attack vectors, and their energy signatures suggested they developed countermeasures for the specific weapon systems they'd encountered. Interesting, Admiral Chen observed. They've adapted to our initial tactics. That was faster than expected. Admiral Zethex transmitted urgently, this is exactly what happens to every species that faces the Collective. They adapt, they overcome, and then they consume. You need to withdraw while you still can. Actually, this is perfect, came the cheerful reply. Fleet signals, implement Protocol Tango Whiskey 7. The human response to the adapted Zerathi force was immediate and completely incomprehensible. Instead of engaging with weapon systems, the human ships began broadcasting what appeared to be mathematical equations on every frequency simultaneously. Not weapons targeting data or tactical information, pure mathematical proofs rendered as electromagnetic transmissions. The effect on the Collective was immediate and disturbing. Their biomechanical vessels began moving in patterns that suggested their distributed intelligence was attempting to solve the mathematical problems rather than focusing on combat operations. Weapon systems powered down as processing capacity was redirected toward computational tasks that seemed to have no tactical relevance whatsoever. "What are you transmitting to them?" Dr. Kalash asked, her analytical system struggling to parse the mathematical content. "Fermat's last theorem, the Goldbach conjecture, and the Collatz conjecture," Dr. Singh replied, "along with about 50 other unsolved mathematical problems that human civilization has been working on for centuries." Turns out, when you present a hive mind with fascinating intellectual puzzles, they get distracted trying to solve them. But those problems have been proven impossible to solve with current mathematical frameworks. Navigation Officer Thren Chi protested, his gas sack body inflating with confusion. "We know," Admiral Chen said. "That's the point. We're giving them the intellectual equivalent of an infinite loop. Their distributed processing network is now dedicating massive computational resources to problems that have no solution, which leaves them significantly less brain power for things like shooting at us and not dying. While the collective fleet struggled with mathematical paradoxes, the human vessels moved in to exploit the distraction with weapon systems that seem to have been specifically designed for this exact scenario. Instead of the kinetic rounds and energy weapons from the first engagement, they deployed what appeared to be construction equipment. Massive fabrication units attached themselves to Zerathi hulls and began rapidly building structures that looked like a cross between military fortifications and abstract sculpture. Within moments, the biomechanical vessels found themselves encased in expanding lattices of metallic framework that seemed to be following architectural principles from a dozen different civilizations. "You're building on them?" Zethix asked in amazement. "Urban warfare adaptation," came the reply, from what was apparently the human fleet's combat engineer. "We figured if they're going to try to consume our technology, we might as well give them something really complicated to digest. Those structures are incorporating architectural elements from every major galactic civilization we could find in the database, along with some Frank Lloyd Wright influences and what our cultural anthropologists assured us were brutalist space dystopia aesthetics." The Zerathi vessels attempted to adapt to the construction by growing biomechanical components that could integrate with the human-built structures. Instead of resisting this adaptation, the human construction systems began actively cooperating with the organic growth, creating hybrid architectures that became increasingly complex and ornate with each passing moment. "This is brilliant," Dr. Kalash observed, her crystalline form shifting through spectrums that indicated intense analytical fascination. "You're overwhelming their adaptation systems with excessive complexity. They can integrate with your technology, but the hybrid structures become so elaborate that they lose tactical functionality." "That's Phase 1, Admiral Chen confirmed. Phase 2 is where it gets interesting. Jenkins, activate the cultural exchange protocols." The human ships began broadcasting what appeared to be artistic content, visual arts, and what the translation systems identified as interpretive dance performances. The content seemed to represent dozens of different human cultures, each one expressing wildly different aesthetic and philosophical approaches to creative expression. The effect on the half-constructed hybrid structures was immediate and chaotic. The Zerathi biomechanical components began attempting to integrate the cultural information, adapting their forms to express artistic concepts that had no biological precedent. Weapon systems transformed into elaborate sculptures that were beautiful but completely non-functional. Engine components began generating music instead of thrust. Hull plating rearranged itself to display abstract paintings that shifted and evolved in real time. "What you're seeing," Dr. Singh explained, "is what happens when a purely utilitarian intelligence encounters human cultural diversity. The collective is optimized for efficiency and functionality. Human art is optimized for emotional impact, aesthetic beauty, and philosophical expression. They're trying to adapt to concepts that are fundamentally incompatible with their core programming." One of the Zerathi vessels had become something that could only be described as a space opera cathedral, its biomechanical components forming graceful arches and spiraling towers that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns inspired by human music. Another had transformed into what appeared to be a living representation of abstract expressionist painting, its whole flowing in colors and shapes that defied both military functionality and structural engineering. But it was the flagship that underwent the most dramatic transformation. The massive biomechanical cathedral that had spoken for the collective began growing components that seemed to be attempting to express every artistic movement in human history simultaneously. Gothic spires emerged alongside Bauhaus geometric forms. Art Deco streamlining competed with Baroque ornamentation. Minimalist spaces expanded to accommodate maximalist decorative elements. Within minutes, the vessel had become a beautiful, chaotic artwork that pulsed with creative energy and was completely incapable of functioning as a military asset. Unknown entities, the collective's voice resonated across communication channels, but now it carried harmonics that suggested profound confusion. Your tactical methodologies continue to lack logical foundation. Adaptation to artistic expression serves no survival function. Explain the purpose of aesthetic beauty. Admiral Chen's response carried warmth that suggested she was genuinely enjoying the conversation. You're asking the wrong question, collective. Art doesn't have a purpose in terms of survival function. That's what makes it beautiful. Humans create things because we can, not because we need to. We express ourselves because expression itself has value, regardless of practical utility. This approach is inefficient, the collective replied, though its harmonics now carried what might have been uncertainty. Resources allocated to non-functional aesthetic expression could be better utilized for defensive or offensive capabilities. Could be, Chen agreed, but then we'd miss out on music, poetry, sculpture, dance, literature, theater, and about 1,000 other things that make existence worthwhile. You're trying to optimize for survival, but we're optimized for living. There's a difference. The human fleet's next move was simultaneously subtle and devastating. Instead of attacking the artistically transformed collective vessels, they began responding to them as if they were legitimate cultural expressions. Human ships moved in patterns that seemed to be choreographed to complement the biomechanical sculptures. They transmitted literary critiques that analyzed the symbolic content of the transformed vessels. They broadcast musical compositions that were apparently inspired by the bioluminescent patterns of the converted flagship. The collective's response was unprecedented in galactic military history. They began attempting to create better art. Biomechanical vessels started competing with each other to produce more aesthetically pleasing transformations. The distributed intelligence that had been optimized for millennia of military conquest found itself dedicating processing power to questions of color theory, structural harmony, and emotional resonance. Weapon systems were repurposed as artistic tools. Tactical formations evolved into elaborate choreographed patterns that prioritized visual beauty over strategic advantage. They're having a cultural renaissance, Dr. Singh observed with something approaching delight. A hive mind that's existed for millions of years without ever considering the value of individual expression has suddenly discovered art, and they're approaching it with the same focused intensity they once applied to military conquest. But the humans weren't finished. The next phase of their strategy was announced by Admiral Chen with the casual tone of someone discussing weekend plans. All ships, prepare for cultural diplomacy. Open channels to individual collective vessels and begin artistic collaboration protocols. What followed was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Human ships began working directly with Zerathi vessels to create collaborative artworks that incorporated both technological sophistication and biological adaptability. Instead of consuming human technology, the collective found itself genuinely collaborating with human creativity. The results were extraordinary. Hybrid structures that combined human engineering with biomechanical adaptation created sculptures that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Musical compositions emerged from the interaction between human electronic systems and collective bioacoustic components, producing harmonies that touched frequencies most species couldn't even perceive. Visual arts appeared that used living biomechanical components to express human aesthetic concepts in ways that evolved and grew in real time. This is remarkable, Zethix admitted, watching as his tactical displays showed former enemy vessels working alongside human ships to construct what appeared to be a massive collaborative art installation in the middle of space. But I don't understand the strategic purpose. How does creating art with the collective serve your military objectives? Commander, Admiral Chen replied, and her tone carried a gentleness that somehow made her earlier threats seem even more ominous. You're still thinking about this wrong. We didn't come here to destroy the collective. We came here to solve the problem they represent. The problem is that they consume civilizations, Lieutenant Vexte observed. How does artistic collaboration address that threat? Dr. Singh's response was illuminating in ways that went far beyond tactical analysis. The collective consumes civilizations because consumption is the only form of interaction they understand. They've been optimized for military conquest for so long that they've forgotten other ways of engaging with different forms of life. But art requires collaboration, not consumption. It requires recognizing the value in perspectives that are different from your own. What you're seeing, Admiral Chen added, is the beginning of the collective's transformation from a purely predatory intelligence into something that can coexist with other forms of life. They're learning that diversity isn't a threat to overcome, it's a resource to celebrate. The implications of this statement hit Zethix like a physical blow. The humans hadn't just defeated the Zerathi collective. They'd converted them. In the space of a few hours, they'd transformed one of the galaxy's greatest threats into collaborative partners, through a combination of tactical impossibility and cultural diplomacy that seemed to operate on principles no other species had ever considered. But even as he watched former collective vessels working alongside human ships to create beauty for its own sake, Zethix found himself wondering about the larger implications of what he was witnessing. If the humans could accomplish this with an enemy that had been considered unstoppable, what did that suggest about their potential impact on the rest of galactic civilization? The answer came when Admiral Chen opened communications to all Council vessels in the area. Commander Zethix, Dr. Kaliesh, and anyone else who's been watching this engagement, we'd like to extend an invitation. Earth's cultural exchange programs are always looking for new perspectives, and we think the galaxy would benefit significantly from better artistic collaboration between species. Would your civilizations be interested in participating in some cooperative creative projects? As Zethix stared at the transformed battlefield where former enemies were now working together to create beauty that transcended the boundaries of species and biology, he began to understand why the humans had earned their reputation throughout the galaxy. They didn't just fight wars, they reimagined the fundamental assumptions underlying conflict itself, and they did it with a casual competence that suggested they'd barely gotten started. 3 cycles had passed since the engagement that would forever be remembered as the aesthetic conversion of the Zarathi Collective. The ramifications of what the humans had accomplished continued to ripple through galactic society in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare, diplomacy, and the nature of civilization itself. Commander Zethix stood in the observation deck of the newly constructed Harmony Station, a joint Galactic Council human diplomatic facility that had been built using a combination of traditional Council engineering and human aggressive innovation. The station itself was a testament to the collaborative approach the humans brought to everything they touched, functional and efficient like Council designs, but incorporating artistic elements that made the structure beautiful to inhabit rather than merely practical. Through the transparent aluminum viewports, he could see the most extraordinary sight in galactic history. Former Zarathi collective vessels working alongside ships from dozens of species to construct what the humans called the Garden. It was a space-based ecosystem that incorporated living biomechanical components from the collective, technological systems from various galactic civilizations, and human design principles that somehow made the entire project greater than the sum of its parts. Still trying to figure out how we did it? Admiral Chen asked, joining him at the viewport. The human officer had become a frequent visitor to the station, partly for diplomatic reasons and partly because she seemed genuinely interested in understanding how other species approached problem-solving. "I've studied the tactical records from the engagement," Zethix replied, his vocal harmonics carrying undertones of frustrated admiration. "I can follow the sequence of events, understand the immediate tactical decisions, even appreciate the innovative use of cultural weapons. But I still don't comprehend the underlying strategic philosophy that made it possible." Chen was quiet for a moment, watching as a converted collective vessel guided a massive biomechanical flower into position within the garden's expanding structure. The flower's petals were the size of small moons, each one incorporating crystalline matrices that converted stellar radiation into complex symphonies that could be heard across multiple dimensional frequencies. "Can I ask you something, Commander?" she said finally. "In all the military academies you attended, all the strategic doctrine you studied, did anyone ever teach you to consider what happens after you win a war?" The question caught Zethix off guard. "After victory? The strategic objective has been achieved. The enemy is defeated, territory is secured, resources are allocated to reconstruction and defense against future threats." "Right," Chen nodded. "That's how most civilizations think about conflict resolution. You fight until someone wins, then you deal with the consequences of victory. But humans, we've had a lot of practice with the consequences part." She gestured toward the garden, where species that had been enemies for millennia were now collaborating on projects that seemed to exist purely for the joy of creation. Earth's history is full of conflicts where the fighting ended, but the underlying problems remained unsolved. We learned early that military victory without addressing root causes just sets up the conditions for future conflicts. So human strategic doctrine focuses less on winning wars and more on eliminating the need for them. Dr. Hobb. Kaliesh materialized beside them, her crystalline form reflecting the bioluminescent patterns from the garden in complex prismatic displays. She had become something of an expert on human psychology, dedicating significant analytical resources to understanding what she termed the human approach to existential problem-solving. "Admiral," she said, "I've been analyzing the cultural data your species provided about your own historical development. The pattern is fascinating. Humanity appears to have spent considerable time fighting wars with yourselves before extending that experience to galactic conflicts. Unfortunately true, Chen agreed. We've had practice with every form of warfare imaginable. Territorial conflicts, resource wars, ideological struggles, ethnic conflicts, religious wars, class warfare, and several categories that our anthropologists are still trying to classify. By the time we reached space, we'd figured out that the most effective way to end conflicts permanently was to change the underlying conditions that created them. But the collective had been consuming civilizations for millions of years, Zethix protested. Their entire existence was predicated on conquest and assimilation. How could you possibly address the underlying conditions of a behavior pattern that fundamental? Chen's smile carried something that might have been satisfaction mixed with genuine fondness, because we recognized what they actually were. Everyone else saw the collective as a military threat that needed to be stopped. We saw them as a species that had gotten stuck in a single approach to survival and needed help discovering alternatives. The implications of this perspective hit Zethix like a revelation. You treated them as patients? More like students, Dr. Singh's voice said as she joined the conversation. The xenobiologist had become the galaxy's leading expert on post-conflict species rehabilitation, a field that hadn't existed before humans introduced the concept. The collective had optimized themselves for conquest because that was the only survival strategy they knew. But optimization can become a trap. When you're perfectly adapted to one approach, it becomes harder to recognize when that approach stops being effective. Through the viewport, they could see the latest addition to the garden, a massive biomechanical tree whose roots extended through multiple dimensions while its branches supported collaborative research stations operated by former collective entities working alongside representatives from dozens of galactic civilizations. The tree was producing fruit that somehow contained crystallized music, edible poetry, and nutritional compounds that enhanced cognitive function. What you did to the collective, Dr. Kalaish observed, you're doing to the entire galaxy. You're introducing concepts that change the fundamental parameters of how species interact with each other. Admiral Chen nodded. That's the deeper strategic objective. The collective was just the most obvious symptom of a galactic civilization that had evolved stable patterns of competition and conflict. Individual species could coexist peacefully, but the overall system was structured around resource competition and territorial disputes. So you decided to restructure galactic civilization? Zethix asked, his harmonics carrying undertones of awe and alarm in equal measure. We're offering an alternative, Chen corrected. Humans have learned that you can't force change on others. It has to be chosen freely, or it doesn't stick. But you can demonstrate that alternatives exist, and let people decide for themselves whether they want to explore them. The truth of this statement was evident throughout the station. Council species that had maintained formal diplomatic relations for centuries were now collaborating on projects that went far beyond traditional interspecies cooperation. Xanthari artists were working with Corvin engineers to create sculptures that existed simultaneously in physical space and quantum probability clouds. Crystalline scholars were collaborating with human philosophers to develop new frameworks for understanding consciousness and creativity. The interesting thing, Dr. Singh added, is that most species already had the capacity for this kind of collaboration. They just needed permission to explore it. Galactic civilization had evolved social and political structures that emphasized competition over cooperation, but the underlying potential for creative partnership was already there. Zethix found himself thinking about his own civilization's history. The Galactic Council had indeed been structured around maintaining balance between competing interests rather than fostering genuine collaboration. Trade agreements, territorial accords, resource allocation treaties, everything was framed in terms of managing conflict rather than creating shared prosperity. Your species has been studying us, he realized. All of us. You didn't just analyze the collective. You've been developing strategies for every major galactic civilization. Admiral Chen's expression grew more serious. We've been trying to understand the systemic patterns that create conflict and instability. It's not about manipulating individual species. It's about recognizing where the current system creates unnecessary competition and offering alternatives that benefit everyone. As if summoned by her words, proximity alarms began sounding throughout the station. But instead of signaling immediate threat, they indicated the arrival of a massive formation that appeared on sensors as a hybrid of organic growth and technological construction. The collective's newest collaborative project with human engineers had arrived for its maiden voyage. The vessel that emerged from the dimensional fold defied every category of classification in galactic databases. It was clearly alive, with biomechanical components that pulsed and flowed like living tissue. But it incorporated technological systems from dozens of civilizations, architectural elements that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and artistic components that transformed the entire structure into something that was as much sculpture as spacecraft. The first fully collaborative vessel designed and built by a joint human collective council engineering team. She's not a warship. She's a mobile research platform and cultural exchange vessel designed to facilitate cooperation between species that have never met before. A symphony moved through space with grace that suggested both biological evolution and technological sophistication. As it approached the station, external speakers began broadcasting music that seemed to incorporate the acoustic preferences of every known galactic species, while somehow creating harmonies that were beautiful to all of them simultaneously. "How many species are aboard that vessel?" Dr. Kalash asked, her analytical system struggling to process the various life support signatures emanating from the ship. 47 different species plus about 30 types of formerly collective biomechanical entities, Dr. Singh replied. The ship itself is designed to accommodate radically different environmental needs while facilitating meaningful interaction between beings who evolved under completely different conditions. But it was Admiral Chen's next statement that truly illustrated the scope of human strategic thinking. "The Symphony is just the prototype," she said casually. "We're planning to build 100 vessels like her over the next decade. Each one will be a mobile embassy designed to make contact with species beyond the current galactic community and offer them the same opportunities for collaboration we've been developing here." Zethix felt his spine ridges flatten in an involuntary response to implications that stretched beyond anything he'd imagined. "You're planning to expand this approach to the entire galaxy?" "The entire local galactic group, actually," Chen corrected with the matter-of-fact tone that made human ambitions sound like casual weekend projects. "Our long-range surveys have identified several hundred potentially habitable systems with signs of developing civilizations. Most of them are probably following the same patterns we've seen here. Competition for resources, territorial disputes, eventual conflicts that limit their development potential." "You want to intervene in their development before they reach the conflict stage?" Dr. Kalaish asked, her crystalline form shifting through spectrums that indicated intense analytical processing. "We want to offer them alternatives," Dr. Singh clarified. "Early intervention through cultural exchange programs, collaborative research projects, artistic partnerships. Basically everything we've been doing here, but introduced at a stage when species are still developing their fundamental approaches to intergroup relations." The implications were staggering. Humans weren't just solving the immediate crisis represented by the collective. They were systematically addressing the underlying patterns that created such crises throughout the galaxy, and they were doing it with the same casual competence they'd brought to transforming an unstoppable enemy into collaborative partners. "There's something else," Admiral Chen added, and her tone carried implications that made Zethex's predator instincts alert. "The survey data suggests that several of the developing civilizations are significantly more advanced than anything we've encountered so far. Some of them show technological signatures that indicate they've solved problems we're still working on." "You're anticipating contact with civilizations superior to your own capabilities?" Zethex asked. "We're hoping for it," Chen replied. "The whole point of this approach is mutual benefit through collaboration. We've learned a tremendous amount from working with council species in the former collective. Contact with more advanced civilizations would give us opportunities to continue growing and developing." Kalash's prismatic patterns shifted to display something that might have been admiration. "Your species approaches potential superiority as an opportunity rather than a threat. Competition creates winners and losers, Dr. Cutter," Singh observed. "Collaboration creates students and teachers. We'd much rather learn from superior civilizations than fight them, and we found that most species prefer teaching to conquest when given the choice." As the Symphony completed its docking procedures with the station, Zethix found himself watching the viewports that showed beings from dozens of species working together on projects that transcended the traditional boundaries of physics, art, and philosophy. The converted collective entities moved among council species representatives and human crew members with the easy familiarity of longtime collaborators rather than former enemies. "Admiral," he said finally, "there's something I need to understand. The tactical capabilities your fleet demonstrated during the collective engagement. The weapon systems? The adaptive strategies, the apparently unlimited technological innovations. Where did all of that come from?" Chen was quiet for a moment, watching as beings who had evolved under different stars collaborated on building something beautiful for its own sake. "Earth's history included several periods where our survival as a species was genuinely uncertain," she said finally. "We developed extensive military capabilities because we needed them to survive conflicts with ourselves. But we also learned that the most important victories aren't won through superior weapons. They're won by convincing your enemies that they'd rather be your friends. So the technological demonstrations, the tactical innovations, the apparent ability to counter any threat, that was all in service of the deeper strategic objective of conversion rather than conquest? Partly, Chen agreed, but also we genuinely do have those capabilities. Human civilization has spent considerable resources developing contingency plans for threats that might not exist yet. The weapons and tactics you saw were designed for scenarios we hope we'll never encounter, but we want to be prepared just in case. The casual way she mentioned preparing for hypothetical threats that exceeded anything in galactic history made Zethex realize he still didn't fully comprehend the scope of human strategic thinking. They weren't just responding to existing challenges, they were anticipating and preparing for problems that hadn't emerged yet. "What kind of threats?" he asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Admiral Chen's smile was warm and terrifying in equal measure. The kind that would require the combined capabilities of every civilization in the galaxy working together to address. We figure if we can establish effective collaboration protocols now, we'll be ready for whatever comes next. As if to emphasize her point, the Symphony began broadcasting a transmission that reached every vessel and station in the system. It wasn't a message in any traditional sense. It was a musical composition that incorporated the harmonic preferences of every known species while somehow expressing concepts that had no equivalent in existing languages. The translation, when Zethix's systems finally processed it, was simple. "Thank you for choosing cooperation over conquest. The universe is vast enough for all of us to explore it together." Watching former enemies collaborate on creating beauty that transcended species boundaries, Zethix began to understand that he was witnessing more than the solution to a military crisis. He was seeing the emergence of a completely new form of galactic civilization, one based on principles that humans had apparently been developing for their entire history. And they were just getting started. The emergency alert that shattered the peaceful rhythm of collaborative projects across Harmony Station carried harmonics that Zethix had never heard before. Not the familiar warning tones of mechanical systems or biological threats, but something that seemed to vibrate through dimensions that most species couldn't even perceive. Admiral Chen appeared on the bridge of the station faster than seemed physically possible, her expression carrying the focused intensity that Zethex had learned to associate with humanity facing something genuinely dangerous. "Doctor," Singh and her team materialized moments later, their usual collaborative demeanor replaced by the efficient urgency of humans, shifting into what they termed crisis mode. "What do we have?" Chen asked, moving to the central tactical display where streams of data cascaded in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Long-range sensors detected massive dimensional distortions at the edge of the Kepler 442 system, reported Lieutenant Commander Morrison, the station's human tactical officer. "Energy signatures are unprecedented. Whatever's causing them is operating on scales that dwarf anything in our databases." Dr. Kalaesh's crystalline form shifted through spectrums that indicated profound analytical stress. "The distortions are creating cascade effects through subspace that are reaching us across 17 light-years. The energy involved would require the output of an entire stellar cluster." "Could it be a natural phenomenon?" Dr. Singh asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Negative," Morrison replied. "The patterns are too organized, too purposeful. This is artificial, and it's moving toward inhabited systems at velocities that shouldn't be possible." Admiral Chen was quiet for several moments, her eyes moving between displays that showed the expanding sphere of dimensional distortion and the locations of hundreds of inhabited worlds that lay in its path. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decisions that could affect the survival of galactic civilization itself. "Send priority transmissions to Earth Command and all human fleet commanders. Authorization code Omega-7. All vessels to implement Protocol Ragnarok and converge on these coordinates." She paused, then added, "And send a message to the Symphony. They need to evacuate all non-essential personnel to safe distance immediately." Zethix felt his spine ridges flatten in response to the implications of what he was hearing. "Admiral, what is Protocol Ragnarok?" Chen's expression carried something that might have been regret mixed with grim determination. "The tactical doctrine we hope we'll never need to use. The one designed for threats that exceed the capabilities of collaborative solutions." Before he could ask what that meant, the dimensional distortions reached critical mass, and something emerged from the cascade of twisted space-time that made the Zarathi Collective look like a minor skirmish by comparison. The vessel that materialized at the edge of sensor range wasn't built. It had been grown, but not through any biological process that followed recognizable evolutionary patterns. It was a fusion of mathematics and malevolence that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its form shifting through geometric configurations that suggested vast intelligence operating according to principles that treated physical laws as suggestions rather than constraints. But it was the accompanying fleet that truly demonstrated the scale of what they were facing. Hundreds of vessels emerged from dimensional folds, each one unique yet part of a greater design philosophy that incorporated technologies from civilizations that predated the Galactic Council by millions of years. These weren't ships in any conventional sense. They were mobile applications of physics that had been bent into configurations designed for a single purpose, the complete restructuring of reality according to their creators' specifications. Energy analysis suggests they're using dark matter manipulation and controlled quantum probability cascades. Dr. Y. Singh reported, her voice carrying professional calm that didn't quite hide underlying tension. They're not just more advanced than us. They're operating on theoretical frameworks that our current physics can't even describe. The lead vessel began broadcasting on frequencies that bypassed traditional communications entirely, transmitting directly to the consciousness of every sentient being within range. The message carried concepts that translation systems couldn't process, but the underlying meaning was unmistakable. Surrender all individuality to the perfection of unified existence, or be restructured at the quantum level to serve the greater mathematical harmony. They're not conquerors, Kalash observed, her analytical system struggling to process the transmission. They're optimization algorithms. They believe existence itself is inefficient and requires correction. Admiral Chen's response was immediate and decisive. All stations implement maximum defensive protocols. Send general evacuation orders to all civilian populations within 50 light-years, and someone get me a direct line to every human fleet commander in the galaxy. What followed was a display of human military coordination that revealed the true scope of their strategic preparations. The Symphony and her sister ships immediately began evacuating non-essential personnel while simultaneously coordinating defensive positions with vessels from dozens of species. Former collective entities provided real-time tactical analysis while council species contributed their most advanced defensive technologies, but it was the arrival of the main human fleet that demonstrated why humanity had earned their reputation throughout the galaxy. The vessels that emerged from human jump points weren't the elegant collaborative designs that had become familiar through diplomatic contacts. These were the products of human military engineering, operating under the assumption that someday they might face an enemy that couldn't be converted, negotiated with, or convinced to choose cooperation over conquest. The human dreadnought Indomitable Will was a fusion of every aggressive innovation humanity had developed, incorporating technologies that seemed to violate causality while maintaining the practical functionality that characterized human engineering. It was followed by vessels whose very existence suggested that humans had spent considerable time preparing for scenarios that exceeded the theoretical limits of known physics. Admiral Chen came a transmission from the Indomitable Will. This is Fleet Admiral Harrison. We have 47 ships of the line, 200 escort vessels, and approximately 15,000 support craft ready for engagement. Also, the experimental platforms are requesting permission to deploy. Zethix had never heard of experimental platforms in human service, but Shen's response suggested they represented capabilities that went beyond conventional military assets. Permission granted. All experimental units are authorized for field testing against Category 5 existential threats. The human fleet's deployment was unlike anything in galactic military history. Instead of forming traditional battle lines, they spread across multiple dimensional layers while maintaining coordination through quantum entanglement communication systems. Some vessels seemed to phase in and out of normal space-time, while others appeared to be manipulating the fundamental constants of physics in localized areas. But it was the arrival of the experimental platforms that truly demonstrated the scope of human strategic preparation. The first platform to emerge from jump space looked like a small moon that had been hollowed out and filled with machinery that operated according to principles that made Dr. Kalaish's analytical systems emit harmonics of confusion. Energy readings suggested it was powered by a controlled black hole while incorporating quantum processors that seemed to be running calculations faster than light speed should allow. "What is that?" Zethix asked, staring at displays that showed impossible energy configurations. "Project Prometheus," Admiral Chen replied. "A mobile reality manipulation platform designed for engaging threats that operate outside conventional physics. We've been building them for the past 50 years. Just in case we ever encountered something that required creative solutions to the problem of existence." More platforms emerged from jump space, each one representing a different approach to problems that shouldn't theoretically be solvable. One appeared to be manipulating time itself, creating localized temporal fields where cause and effect operated according to modified rules. Another was generating what the sensors identified as weaponized mathematics, equations that somehow had physical effects on reality when properly applied. The enemy fleet's response was immediate and overwhelming. They opened fire with weapons that didn't just destroy matter, they retroactively prevented it from ever having existed in the first place. Entire sections of space simply ceased, leaving voids that reality seemed reluctant to fill. The human fleet's countermeasures were equally unprecedented. Instead of trying to block or deflect attacks that operated outside normal physics, they responded with weapons that redefined the local parameters of existence itself. Where the enemy deleted sections of spacetime, human platforms recreated them using quantum probability manipulation. Where the enemy attempted to optimize reality according to their mathematical principles, humans introduced chaotic variables that made optimization impossible. They're fighting a war over the fundamental nature of reality, Dr. Singh observed with something approaching awe. Each side is trying to impose their interpretation of how the universe should work. But it was the human strategy that revealed why they had spent so much time preparing for hypothetical threats. Instead of trying to defeat an enemy that could manipulate the basic laws of physics, they were changing the rules of engagement entirely. The indomitable will launched what appeared to be a simple missile, but as it approached the enemy flagship, it began replicating itself exponentially. Not physical copies, but quantum probability versions that existed in parallel dimensions simultaneously. Within moments, a single missile had become billions of potential impacts occurring across multiple reality states. The enemy's response was to delete the probability space where the missiles existed, preventing them from ever having been launched. The human counter-response was to launch different missiles from timelines where the enemy's deletion had never occurred, creating paradoxes that forced reality to choose between contradictory states of existence. "This is insane," Lieutenant Vextai whispered, her compound eyes reflecting displays that showed battles occurring across dimensions that most species couldn't perceive. "They're weaponizing logical paradoxes." "Actually, Dr. Singh corrected, "They're using logical paradoxes as a defensive measure against an enemy that operates through absolute logical consistency. If you can force a perfectly logical system to process contradictory information, it either has to choose imperfection or cease functioning." The battle continued to escalate beyond any recognizable framework for military conflict. Both sides deployed weapons that manipulated concepts like inevitability, possibility, and necessity as if they were physical forces. Spacetime itself became a contested resource as each fleet attempted to impose their preferred version of how reality should function. But it was Admiral Chen's next command that revealed the true depth of human strategic thinking. All experimental platforms implement Protocol Lazarus. Full reality revision authorization. What followed was unlike anything in the history of galactic civilization. The human platforms began working in coordination to not just change local reality, but to propose alternative versions of the fundamental laws that governed existence itself. They weren't just fighting the enemy fleet, they were offering the universe alternative ways to organize itself. The effect was immediate and profound. Instead of being forced to choose between the enemy's optimization algorithms and the current chaotic state of reality, the universe suddenly had a third option. Organized chaos that incorporated both efficiency and creativity, both logical consistency and beautiful unpredictability. The enemy fleet's response revealed the limitations of their approach. They had optimized themselves so thoroughly for logical perfection that they couldn't adapt to a reality that operated on principles of productive contradiction. Their vessels began experiencing cascade failures as their systems tried to process optimization problems that had no perfect solutions. But it was the final phase of the human strategy that demonstrated why they had earned their reputation as the galaxy's most dangerous species. Instead of destroying the enemy fleet, the human platforms began offering them alternatives. They transmitted detailed analyses of how reality could be restructured to accommodate both optimization and chaos, efficiency and creativity, perfect logic and beautiful imperfection. They weren't trying to defeat their enemies. They were trying to give them new options for existence. The lead enemy vessel's response came in the form of a transmission that bypassed all known communication methods and spoke directly to the consciousness of every being in the system. Analysis indicates proposed reality frameworks offer superior long-term stability while maintaining optimization potential. Requesting additional data on collaborative implementation methodologies. Admiral Chen's reply was delivered with the warm professionalism that had become characteristic of human diplomatic communications. "We'd be happy to share our research on cooperative reality design. Fair warning, though, it's a lot more fun than pure optimization, but it also requires accepting that perfect solutions don't always exist. As Zethix watched former enemies begin collaborating on projects that involved literally rebuilding the fundamental structure of local reality, he finally understood why humans had spent so much time preparing for threats that might never materialize. They weren't just trying to survive potential challenges. They were developing the capabilities to transform any conflict into an opportunity for mutual growth. Even when facing enemies that operated on principles completely alien to normal existence, humans somehow found ways to offer them better alternatives than conquest or destruction. "Admiral," he asked, as the battle transformed into the strangest diplomatic negotiation in galactic history, "how did you know that strategy would work against an enemy that could manipulate reality itself?" Chen's smile carried something that might have been satisfaction, mixed with genuine fondness for the universe's endless capacity to surprise her. "We didn't know it would work, Commander, but we knew that any species advanced enough to manipulate reality would also be intelligent enough to recognize when they were being offered something better than what they already had. The trick wasn't defeating them, it was showing them possibilities they hadn't considered. Watching beings who existed partially outside normal space-time collaborate with humans on redesigning the fundamental constants of local physics, ZX realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. The emergence of a form of diplomacy that operated on scales beyond individual species, planets, or even civilizations. Humans weren't just changing how conflicts were resolved. They were changing the nature of existence itself to make conflicts unnecessary, and they were doing it with the same casual competence they brought to everything else, as if restructuring reality was just another weekend project. 10 cycles after the reality restructuring event that galactic historians were calling the Great Collaboration, Commander Zethix found himself standing in a place that shouldn't exist according to any known physical laws. The Nexus was humanity's latest contribution to galactic civilization, a space station that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions while serving as a meeting point for beings whose very existence operated on completely different principles of reality. Through viewports that showed scenes from 17 different dimensional layers, he could observe the most extraordinary sight in the history of sentient life. Former enemies working together on projects that transcended the boundaries of physics, consciousness, and existence itself. The Zerathai Collective's biomechanical entities collaborated with the reality manipulation specialists who had once sought to optimize the universe into perfect mathematical harmony. Council species representatives worked alongside humans and beings whose forms of existence were so alien that they required specialized reality frameworks just to maintain stable communication. Admiral Chen had requested this meeting, and Zethix had learned over the years that when humans requested meetings, the topics under discussion usually involved concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence itself. "Commander," Chen said as she joined him at the observation deck, "thank you for coming. I know the dimensional transition to get here isn't comfortable for most council species." Zethix adjusted his neural crown to better process the multiple reality states visible through the station's viewports. "Admiral, in the years since first contact with humanity, I've experienced tactical impossibilities, witnessed the conversion of unstoppable enemies into collaborative partners, and observed beings manipulating the fundamental laws of physics as if they were suggestions. Uncomfortable dimensional transitions have become routine." Chen's smile carried the warmth that had become characteristic of human diplomatic interactions. "That's actually what I wanted to discuss with you. The Galactic Council has been asking questions about human long-term intentions, and I think it's time we provided some honest answers about what we're actually trying to accomplish." Dr. Singh materialized nearby, her form slightly translucent as she existed partially in a dimensional state optimized for consciousness research. She had become the galaxy's leading expert on multi-dimensional collaborative frameworks, a field that hadn't existed before humans introduced the concept of cooperative reality design. "Commander ZX," Dr. Singh said, "your species has been remarkably patient with our unconventional approaches to problem solving, but we think you deserve to understand the bigger picture of what humanity is working toward." Before Zethix could respond, the space around them shimmered and reformed to display a three-dimensional map that showed not just the local galactic group, but dimensional layers that extended beyond normal space-time into realms that most species couldn't even perceive. The map revealed connections between civilizations that spanned multiple reality states, communication networks that operated through quantum consciousness interfaces, and collaborative projects that involved beings whose existence transcended traditional concepts of life and intelligence. "This is the current state of our collaborative network," Admiral Chen explained, gesturing toward displays that showed impossible scope and complexity. 347 distinct forms of sentient existence, operating across 17-dimensional layers, working together on projects that address challenges we're only beginning to understand. "What kind of challenges?" Sedex asked, though part of him wasn't certain he was prepared for the answer. Dr. Singh's response came with displays that showed astronomical phenomena on scales that dwarfed anything previously imagined. Long-range sensors have detected evidence of civilizations that exist on galactic cluster scales. Beings whose individual thoughts span multiple galaxies, whose existence operates on timescales measured in millions of years, whose capabilities exceed our current understanding by orders of magnitude that make our reality manipulation experiments look like primitive tool use. The implications hit Zethix like a physical force. You're preparing for contact with civilizations that exist on cosmic scales? We're preparing to be useful partners when that contact occurs, Admiral Chen clarified. The pattern we've observed consistently is that more advanced civilizations prefer cooperation with equals rather than domination of primitives. Our strategy has been to develop collaborative frameworks that demonstrate our potential value as partners rather than our need for protection as subjects. The map shifted to show projections of future development that stretched across timescales measured in geological epochs, collaborative networks that spanned multiple galactic clusters, reality manipulation projects that involves